And thank you to Sandra for setting everything up. We do have coffee, water, snacks over here. Please help yourself. So I'm very honored to introduce our speaker for today, David Fleet from the University of Toronto. I'll just give a brief introduction. I've known David for a number of years. He's one of our Canada's, I think, best known computer vision and machine learning researchers. He did his PhD with Alan Jepson at the University of Toronto, working on models of motion processing, tracking, so forth. And that work was very influential. And then following from that, I just actually noticed, I just checked out Google Scholar and noticed that the most cited paper is actually a optic flow review with John Darrow, right, from around that time. From his PhD, he took a faculty position at Queen's University, and from there went to Xerox PARC, where Michael Black was still there at that time, I think, and he had a very active collaboration with Michael Black that generated a lot of very cool research in, again, motion processing, generated a number of awards at major computer vision conferences like ICCV and CVPR. And I don't know which award you're most proud of, David, but I think the Quindring Award is a pretty high honor that they received for that work. After Xerox PARC, David, you came back to Toronto. Did I miss something? No? Okay, sure. And took a faculty position at the University of Toronto, and has been there since that time, and has made major contributions to research and also to leadership. So he's been chair, head of department at U of T Scarborough, has taken responsibility for a number of editorial leadership positions for IEEE PAMI, for example, which I think is maybe the most high-impact journal at IEEE. So that's a pretty big job. And his work has branched out in a number of really cool ways. So one research area that you might be aware of is his work in cryo-EM algorithm development. That's had a major impact and has led to a spin-off company, which I hear is doing pretty well. And I guess most recently, this work on diffusion models. So I should say that now David's at Google DeepMind and still pushing boundaries in research. And this, as I'm sure you know, is one of the big research breakthroughs in AI in the last couple of years. So I think it's a really great deal for us, opportunity for us to have David here to speak about that. I think that's all I wanted to say, and I should sort of give a more formal description of Dave's current position. So he's senior fellow of CFAR, or CIAR, I guess, or it's changed names from CIAR to CFAR. He currently holds a Canadian CFAR AI chair. So he's, in addition to his CFAR position, he's maintains his position as a professor in computer science at the University of Toronto and as a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind. So, without further ado,
thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction. Sorry, I'm supposed to stand in front of the camera. Okay. I've been lucky to work with amazing people over the years, and any awards that I might have been a part of is largely due to them, not me. And so I've just been incredibly fortunate. There were a bunch of things I could have talked about today, but what I decided to do was talk about some work in generative models. And many of you may have heard of generative AI. It's in the press, and it's receiving a lot of attention. And I started working on, work on generative models has been going on for a few decades. I started working on it about 25 years ago. At the time, we thought it would be really important to develop good generative models which would act as prior beliefs over observations, like images acoustic signals, etc. And those priors would help regularize inverse problems, like interpreting the structure of the world given an image, which is a relatively unconstrained problem. And we thought that made a lot of sense. And there were also people interested in generative models from the point of view of trying to learn disentangled representations, really efficient representations, which would be able to discern or extract the causal factors of variation in data. And come on in. The fun hasn't started yet. But actually what's interesting is that no one ever thought a generative model would produce a good-looking image. The idea that a generative model would produce a high-resolution, realistic image was extremely far-fetched. I mean, we thought, I didn't even think about it because it didn't make sense. And then everything changed about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, there was the introduction of variational autoencoders and generative adversarial networks, GANs, and deep autoregressive models. And all of a sudden, these models started to produce images which were blowing people away. And there was a flurry of research activity. But on the other hand, if you look at the models from 10 years ago, they're horrible. And so these are images which are random samples from a model learned on CFAR10, which is a bunch of 60,000 images that are 32 by 32 pixels, and these are random samples from ImageNet. Which is like 1 million images. And they don't really look like natural images, but at the time, this blew people away. And it led to a lot of research, which over the next few years really improved the model. So by 2019, Big GAN came out, which could then produce images. This is based on ImageNet. They could produce images that were fairly high resolution, up to 512 by 512, and they really looked fantastic. Now, what's happened in the last 2 years is sort of a revolution, and a revolution, I mean just a change, where the models of choice have transitioned to these generative diffusion models. And in some sense, GANs have been unseated. And so some of you have seen these models, and some of you may have read some of the papers, and I'm not going to go into all the mathematics behind it, but just to set the stage to give you a sense that the way diffusion models work, just like VAEs and many other types of models, including normalizing flows and GANs, is that they essentially model a transition between a tractable distribution that you can sample from and the empirical distribution, which might be very, very complex. So what these models do is they learn this transformation from a simple model into a more complex distribution, which is what you really want to model. In the case of diffusion models, they do this by creating a whole bunch of intermediate distributions which are progressively smoothed versions of the empirical distribution. And then given that sequence, and I'm of course simplifying it here with only 4 distributions, intermediate distributions, but there would be either a continuum or possibly thousands of these distributions. But what it enabled people to do is now draw samples. And the way the sampling process might work is that you'd first, I hope you can see this, everything is small. It's big to me, but But so you might draw a random sample like that little orange dot from the Gaussian distribution, and because these two distributions are really very close, that dot provides a pretty good initial guess for a fair sample from the next distribution, moving right to left. And then what you do is use a really neural network which computes an update or an improvement to that sample, which you can then show under reasonable assumptions is a fair sample from the next distribution. That will give you this 0.2. And it's a form, it effectively takes a step of something that looks like a Markov chain Monte Carlo step, a Langevin step. And you can follow that process throughout all the way down until you get a fair sample from the empirical distribution. So that's roughly, that's all that's going on. Now, with images, the way you smooth the empirical distribution is you just add Gaussian noise to an image. And as you add more and more noise, the image slowly transforms into a white noise signal, which is a random sample from a Gaussian distribution over all the colors of all those pixels. And so the diffusion process is just a noise. All you're doing is accumulating, gradually adding more and more noise. And the reverse process, which is what we're learning to do, is effectively learning to take a noisy image and give you a slightly less noisy image. And the key to that is this neural network, which takes a noisy image and gives you something that is a little less noisy. Now I've sort of exaggerated the amount of noise we're taking away, because again, there might be thousands of steps. And typically the architecture for the network that is used for this is like a multi-scale UNet, which has sort of full self-attention or transformer blocks down at the very sort of low resolution level of the network, where the number of degrees of freedom is sufficiently small that you can handle the quadratic complexity of the self-attention. Okay, that's how diffusion models work. Now, in our case, what we were really interested in were conditional diffusion models. And that's just like a normal diffusion model, except that in addition to the noisy image, which the neural network is going to denoise, the network also gets as input a conditioning signal. Now this could be a label, it could be something semantic like a prompt that describes what's in the image, or it could be another image. It could be a segmentation map or a low resolution image, etc. But that's the idea. So the network simply takes another conditioning signal, and there are many ways to condition on another signal, and the method you would choose might depend on the structure of the conditioning signal. If it's an image, you might do one thing. If it's a single label, which is the semantic category of the image, you might do something different. Okay, so all that said, we first started playing with this, and when I say we, it was actually really an intern actually started playing with this. We had seen these diffusion models, and we thought, wouldn't it be really cool if we could do super resolution with these diffusion models? And when I saw the results, I was just blown away. And the results were not very good initially. Think back to the first images I showed you. We get very excited by just small, encouraging signals of success. But we built that out into a model which could take, for example, an image like this and produce an image that is 16 times higher resolution, but really do a good job. And from that, we were, again, really excited, and we started thinking about, well, what other image restoration tasks could we work on? And for that, we developed a model which we called Palette, which is really just a multitask sort of image restoration model. And it could do all sorts of different things. So it could take a grayscale image and output and output colored samples, or it could take an image that's missing a bunch of stuff and do some in-painting. And these are all old tasks. James, for example, has worked on in-painting. These are tasks that the vision community has looked at for many, many years. But this model had sort of two really interesting properties from my point of view. One, it was a multitask model, so it did all these tasks. But the other is, it really showed the power of diffusion models for capturing complex multimodal distribution. So if I give you a color image, it should make sense that there are probably many colored images which are consistent with a given grayscale images, or there are many ways to fill in the hole in this image, right? And what you'd really like, if you're really capturing the probability distribution over images conditioned on these inputs, it should be a fairly complex multimodal distribution. And indeed, with the diffusion models, when we draw random samples, we get all of these different variations, right? So in the bottom row, we're just asking it to complete the right half of the image. And it gives us what are plausible images as output. And then we went on and we started looking at, can we condition on class labels for an image category? And we got some pretty good results. And then we thought, well, if you can condition on a class label, could we condition on open vocabulary text? And that was the impetus for learning the Imagine model, which was a text-to-image model. And that had a number of interesting components. The first was using rich, large language models to encode text, and exploiting our super resolution models so that the way we would get to really high resolution models is we first generate a small image that was consistent with the text, and then we'd apply our super resolution models, conditioned both on the text and the low resolution image to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that led to the Imagine model, which we published at the end of 2002 at NeurIPS. And the model produces, because of this, you could apply the super resolution model several times, and I mean, I don't know what the limits are, but we've used it to generate images that are up to 4K by 4K. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like, you can zoom in to the point where, you know, like little hairs and leaves and things are there. So there's lots of detail in the image. And we used the same idea to build our first text-to-video models. Again, the same idea that there's some text, you generate like a low resolution in space and time sequence of images, and then you progressively upsample in space and in time, and you get video like this. In this case, it's like, I think this is 1280p at about 24 hertz for 5 seconds or something was this model. And these were all, I mean, super exciting. We were doing the happy dance in the lab all the time. And they were super fun to play with. Actually, the one interesting comment is when we really saw these models shine was not when we played them, it was when we put them in the hands of artists at Google. And they were, like, we were having prompts like a dog in a park. And they would have all sorts of amazing prompts and use the models in ways that were so much more creative than anything we had come up with. That's when we really saw the models shine. And so it was super exciting. But it still left us with a variety of questions, which is, well, so as generative models, how good are these models? I mean, they're producing great samples, but how good are they? And also, what else are they good for? You know, do they serve all the other purposes that I outlined at the very beginning? Now, one thing you see in the generative model literature is that there are a variety of measures of performance for models that measure things like image quality, or they measure how similar the images you're generating are to the data on which you trained the model, for example. And there are measures, the two most common measures are FID, which is a measure of divergence between the distribution of generated images and the distribution of the images from which the model was trained. And another is inception score. And what was super exciting was that, we were getting pretty good scores on some of these things, but we also knew that these scores themselves were not really well correlated with human perception. So we knew they had a variety of weaknesses. And so there's a question about how do we really evaluate these models when they they look really good on scores, the samples look really good, what else should we be doing? And an alternative way of looking at these models is to understand how well they support downstream tasks, other tasks. Like, what do they really help you do? And the idea is something like this. If our model has really captured the probability distribution over the data, then the expected performance on some task that you're using the data for should be the same under your model and the true empirical distribution of the data, right? Because if your model is matching the empirical distribution, for example, it shouldn't matter whether you train a model on synthetic data or real data, right? And also you might think, boy, if your model is really, really good, perhaps you should be able to augment your real data with synthetic data to do even better than you could have with the real data by itself. And machine learning has been using data augmentation as a fundamental trick to get better generalization for many, many years. And maybe that's elastic deformations with MNIST, or maybe it's random crops for ImageNet classification, or maybe it's color modifications for contrastive learning. People have been looking at clever ways of augmenting real data with sort of synthetic modifications of it. But if you could get a generative model that really understood the underlying causal factors of variation, that would sort of be the best augmentation scheme you could imagine in some ways. And so we wanted to look at that. And one question was how. So back in 2019, Ravuri and Oriol Vinyals came out with a paper which they called the classification accuracy score. And it's a simple idea, but I think in some ways profound. What they basically said is, look, if your model is so good, generate a bunch of samples, train an ImageNet classifier on it, and then test it against real data. And the baseline would be a model trained on the real data itself. And you want to say, are you as good as a model trained on real data? And you need to be a little more prescriptive than that to be fair. And so they specified, okay, let's set the rules of the game. The rules of the game are we're going to use a ResNet 50. You're going to train with the same number of samples as we have real data. You're going to train for exactly the same time. You're going to train, they came up with 90 epochs. Maybe their compute in the day was limited to that. And so they specified the rules of the game in a prescribed way, and then you evaluate the performance on the test set. And they did this, and they took the state-of-the-art models at the time, and they did this, and the results were really disappointing. And so the results they got are shown here. Two of the best models at the time in 2019 were VQ-VAE2 and Big GAN D. And so, for example, if you look at the top one accuracy of a model, the model trained on real data got about 73% correct. And these other models are really very, very poor. The VQ-VAE2 did pretty well at 54%, but really sort of uninspiring. There are a number of different ways of looking at the output, but this was kind of a nice one that they showed, which was which was for each of the 1,000 classes, each point here is the accuracy of a model on that class. And the blue points are the model trained on real data. And the red points are, respectively, the VQ-VAE and the Big GAN model, or the models trained on the VQ-VAE synthetic samples and the Big GAN synthetic examples. And what you see is that the performance across the board generally is quite a bit worse than the model trained on real data, with the VQ-VAE giving, the red points are a little bit higher than the Big GAN model, so they look a little better. And they did one other experiment too. They also played with data augmentation, but what they found is when you added any synthetic data almost at all to the real data, performance immediately dropped very quickly. In this case, this is the top 5 performance. And the only model that seemed to do okay initially is the Big GAN model, but they used what is a very, very small truncation parameter. So the truncation parameter basically says when you sample from the Gaussian, you want to sample really close to the mode. And so a small truncation parameter, what that effectively does is it sacrifices diversity for image quality, right? Because you're really only going to accept samples that are very close to the mean of the Gaussian. And for that, they got a small boost in performance, but by the time the amount of synthetic data equaled the real data, performance was more or less back to what they would have gotten with the real data all by itself. And so this is, in a way, a disappointing result. And why is this? Well, it could be the quality of the image. It could also be bias in the models, that the distribution just didn't really match the empirical distribution that well. And of course, we were all having fun working on generative models, but there were skeptics in the crowd who say, you guys are always talking about how great these generative models are going to be, but you've been working on it for a few decades now, and frankly, the results have been pretty disappointing. And Ben Poole, who is at Google and a friend, so he had this quote about 4 years ago, which is that, we all say that we're going to be able to use these models for data augmentation, but really, there hasn't been a compelling case. So skip forward. Yeah.
Yeah, may I ask a question? So when you do those comparisons, why do you constrain so that both models are trained on the same amount of data?
Oh, I'll get to that, but you have to wait 4 slides.
Okay.
It's an excellent question. So skip forward to our first diffusion model. So at the time we were doing, text to image, we were also just kind of interested academically on the classification accuracy score as a measure of how well these diffusion models are doing. And so what we did was we were working with Jonathan Ho, who had come up with the first really popular diffusion model called denoising diffusion probabilistic models, the DDPM model. And he had really good models of small ImageNet images, but he could never get it to scale up to large images. And we basically said, well, look, we've got this great super resolution model. Let's combine your low res models with our super resolution models, and then we can generate really big images, and then we could train ImageNet models on those. And so that's what we did. And we called these cascaded diffusion models. And so that allowed us to start with a class like Irish Setter, and this would be like Jonathan's 32 by 32 image, and then we would use our super res to blow it up to something that looked pretty good. And the images looked great, and what we found is that when we started looking at the standard metrics for success, they were also fantastic. So FID is a measure, again, of the distance between the distribution of generated data and the real data, and you want that to be as small as possible because you want the two distributions to be the same. And we thought we really nailed it, because compared to all these other models, we were getting really small FID values. And inception score, generally, higher is better. And so we were doing a great job there. We were really happy with both of these. But again, the acid test was, well, what about classification accuracy score or other kinds of tasks like generative data augmentation? And here, we sort of did the happy dance because we got a great result. We cut the gap between the best known model to date and a model trained on real data. We cut that gap by a half with an accuracy of about 63%, top line. And that was great. But when we, and I'm not going to show you a slide on this because it didn't work very well, when we tried to do generative data augmentation by adding synthetic data to real data, it really didn't give us much of a boost in performance. It was better than the GAN that I showed you earlier, but it wasn't something you would really want to write home about. And so that led us to try and answer your question, which is, okay, how do we do better than that? So about at the beginning of 2023, or in the winter, we started thinking about how we can do a better job leveraging everything we had learned about model architectures, about training diffusion models, etc. And also leverage the fact that now we were finding that these models got better and better and better as we trained on more and more data. And so what we decided to do was basically think about these big text-to-image models as foundation models and ask the question, could we use those to generate ImageNet data and train on that data? And it's a little tricky to do that, and one of the reasons is that the ImageNet classes are often kind of ambiguous. A class like trunk, there are different types of trunks in the world, or chest, there are different types of chest, storage chest, treasure chest, and so the class name in and of itself doesn't necessarily, if you used it in a prompt, a photo of a, it doesn't uniquely determine the image. And there are a bunch of ways to get around this, and people have been exploring this, that you can use variations on prompt expansion. You could use prompt inversion to take ImageNet images, try and infer what the prompt would have been in order to generate those images, and then look at the distribution of prompts. There are a variety of things. We took a really simple approach, which was just to take our big Imagine model and fine-tune it on ImageNet categories with prompts that are just a photo of a class name, right? So that's what we did. And just to give you a sense of the before and after, the images on the left here are for 4 different categories. I'm showing you 4 random samples of what Imagine would have produced with a prompt that is a photo of a X. And what you're seeing on the right are what happens after the fine-tuning. Once the model has been told, a chest from an ImageNet point of view is a treasure chest, right? That's what it's learning through the fine-tuning. So these are the sorts of images we get out, and you can see that they're at least more coherent. And these are just more samples from our fine-tuned ImageNet model. And of course, because ImageNet is a cascaded model, we're actually fine-tuning a 32 by 32 model and a 256 by 256 model and a 1K by 1K model. So we can generate samples at multiple resolutions. And so now you can go and now you can revisit all your metrics for success. And I mean, we were of course, we were really thrilled that we had nailed it. In fact, these numbers seemed so low, we didn't really believe our results. But in retrospect, we had trained on so much more data than ImageNet alone. It makes sense that our models really should be much, much better, because all these other models have really just been trained on the ImageNet samples directly and not on all this other auxiliary data, right? We were training on, many millions of images. Okay. So what about classification accuracy score? Back to the story. So this plot shows, this dashed red line across the top, that's the accuracy of a model trained on real data. These 2 points are the big GAN model and the VQ-VAE, well underperforming the model trained on real data. This point in the middle is what we got with our cascaded diffusion model. And these last 2 points are what we got with generative samples at 256 and with our best model at 1K by 1K. And what they've done is basically gotten to within 3.5% or so of a model trained on real data. And so just, again, by comparison, this is the plot of individual class accuracy of the cascaded diffusion model in red and the model trained on real data in blue. And what you see is for a few classes, the synthetic trained model does better, but for most classes, the model trained on real data does better. But here's what we got with our sort of fine-tuned Imagine model. And what you see is for many classes now, performance exceeds the performance you would have gotten from the real data by itself. And that was really encouraging. And so we really wanted to know how does this generalize? Does this work more generally with other architectures, with other? Remember, this was prescribed. It's ResNet 50. It's a very restricted training protocol, etc. So what we did was we went back, and this was really a lot of work, but we took 15 different state-of-the-art models that existed in the literature, convolutional neural net models, transformer-based models, all sorts of different models. We took every model along with the training recipe that had achieved the state-of-the-art at some point in time. We validated that with the right hyperparameters, we could match that state-of-the-art performance that was in the published literature. And then for every one of those models, for every real data point, we added one synthetic data point. So the amount of data we're training on was twice as much. Half of it was synthetic, half of it was real. And in every case, we saw a fairly large boost in performance, right? And what I'm showing here are only 6 models, which are the ones that took 224 by 224 input. All the other models had different resolutions of input, etc. But in every case, it did really well. And so then you can ask the question, well, what if you add even more data? How much better do you get? And so that's what this slide shows. So this is top 1 accuracy on the top 5 accuracy on the bottom. These are 64 by 64 images, and these are models trained on 1K by 1K images. And so the leftmost point on all these curves is essentially the model trained on real data by itself. And this is when we add synthetic data, and we added synthetic data up to 9 times the amount that you had real data. So the data is almost all synthetic at this point.
So David, I'm curious, are you mixing synthetic and real data at the same time?
Willy-nilly. Yeah. Yeah, no special training protocol, no weighting, no, the model has no clue which images are real, which images are. So there are many smarter ways that we could have done this, I think. But this is just totally mixed. Every epoch was a random sample from the whole thing. And what you see is in the 64 by 64 case, it just gets better and better and better. And what we found with the 1K by 1K images is that performance is pretty good initially up to 1 to 2 times the amount of data, and then slowly degrades back to the performance of the real model when you get out to about 5 times as much data. 4 to 5 times. And that sort of makes sense. Remember, our performance was still 3% lower than the real model. So there must be some bias in our data in some way. And when you add enough of it, your performance is going to start to deteriorate.
Just on that point, you call it bias, but you've already kind of shown how ImageNet is idiosyncratic, right? And so you're kind of playing this game with ImageNet, you're so overfitting to ImageNet, which is not a good representation of the world, probably.
True, but we're testing on ImageNet
Yeah.
as well, so
Yeah.
overfitting on ImageNet shouldn't hurt us.
Yeah, but just addressing the word bias, because
Oh yeah, when I say bias, I mean with respect to the ImageNet empirical distribution, not with respect to the world. We may be biased toward, it's your point, I guess. We are, in fact, biased toward the world, and what we did with fine-tuning was try and pull that back.
So for example, if you took models that were trained on some completely different data set, how would that would be a good benchmark against your
Yeah.
models?
I think that's right. And so we thought this was pretty cool, and I think there are like 4 other people in the world that think this is pretty cool as well. And one of them was Philip Asola, and he was so nice to tweet this comment that this was, really a milestone for generative models, because no generative model had really exhibited capabilities like this previously. Okay, well, so again, let me go back to the original question. So what? So now I've talked a little about how good the models are, but what else are they good for? And I've got a lot of stuff. That was just the intro for the talk. And so I've got a lot of other stuff I want to cover, but I only have a limited time left, 15 minutes at most or so. So what I'll try and do is zip through some of this stuff fairly quickly, just to give you a sense of what we've been up to. So one of the interesting questions that people in the lab have looked at here in Toronto in the Google DeepMind lab is to what extent do these generative models behave like humans? To what extent are they aligned with human perception? And I think this is a really interesting question, because it was well known that a lot of discriminatively trained machine learning models are really not aligned with human perception. And so one of the first questions is, how would you learn a generative classifier with something like a diffusion model? And the way it works is super simple. Let's say you take an image that you want to classify. You're going to add a little bit of noise to it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to denoise it with the diffusion model with a prompt that says image of a, and you're going to give it a class. And maybe it will be the wrong class, but it will still reconstruct something. And you can do this for other classes, and you can eventually do this for all your classes. And then what you could do is select the class that has the highest variational bound on the output. Or to say it another way, select the class that generates images that are as close as possible to your original input image that you're querying, right? And if you do that, it turns out that model works incredibly well, zero shot, compared to all sorts of other representation learning scenarios. It works really, really well. Now, another thing you can ask is, now this gets back to this question of alignment. One of the ways in which human perception seems to differ from some of these discriminatively trained models is revealed through a Q conflict experiment. So if I give you an image like this, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, that's an elephant. That's the sort of skin of an elephant. And a deep learning model will too. And if I give you this image, you'll sort of all say cat, and a deep learning model will as well. But, and this is work by Robert Geierhaus in his PhD thesis a few years ago. If I give you this image, humans will probably still say cat, Robert found, but deep learning models will say elephant. Right? And why is that? And he studied this over an entire data set that had been manufactured to have these Q conflicts. And what he found is that that you can, based on your responses to these, you can measure the extent to which someone is shape biased or texture biased. And what he found is that all these different models, this is for 16 different classes, the degree of texture bias versus shape bias, and these are all discriminatively trained models, but these red points are where a human is, and these green points are where the diffusion model, the generative classifier is. So they appear to be aligned much more with perception. And then Robert and Priyank Jaini extended this work to look at out-of-distribution data sets. So if there are all these data sets which look like ImageNet, but they've been distorted in one way or the other, like some are line drawings and some are blurry, and some, etc. And humans have no trouble telling you what this is, but deep learning models do have trouble. And what they found is that when they tried the text-to-image model on this, they got accuracies very close to human perception. And then the next thing they looked at, which is even more interesting, is they basically said, do different models make the same mistakes? And do different people make them the same mistakes? And how much are people and the machine systems correlated in the mistakes they made? So they produced this huge plot where every point, this is 60 different models and 10 different human subjects, and each point is the correlation and the mistakes that they make. And what they found is that most of the machine learning discriminatively trained models all more or less agree on the errors they make, and all the people agree on the errors they make. But when they looked at the diffusion model, generative classifier, it seemed to agree much more with the people, for example, than discriminatively trained models. So I thought that was a cool result, and it's probably the tip of the iceberg, but worthy of study.
So it's hard to see this. So the yellow and green, those are two generative models?
Yeah, so sorry, you can't read this, but the yellow one is stable diffusion, and the blue one, these two rows are stable diffusion and imagine. These two rows right here in between, that's right. And then we've run this on a few other models, and again, the generative models seem to align better. They're trained with a very different task, right? So, and I'm getting close to the end, but we're also trying to explore these models for the purposes of computer vision. So the question is, how much, if you've got a model that can really generate realistic images, how much of the structure of the world does it understand? How much of the salient or semantic structure in images can they tease out? And so we began to look at this first in the context of two problems that I've worked on in the past, one of which is optical flow. The task is you're given two images and you want to determine for every point in one image, where did it go in the next image? It's fundamentally a correspondence problem. And the other is image to depth, where for every point in the image, I want to know how far away was the thing that projects to that pixel. And there are a couple of reasons to look at this. One is to explore this question of how much do these models understand the world. But the other is the state-of-the-art models for these tasks in computer vision are all very specialized, specific architectures, specific loss functions. They're all trained in just the right way and really honed over time to get the state-of-the-art. And the question is, can we just take a generic model with a fixed architecture and apply it to all these problems, where the only thing that differs is really the structure of the input. So the only thing that our diffusion model is going to act exactly, it's going to be the same architecture modulo the fact that the conditioning signals are different. And there are a bunch of real challenges in training it, but just so we're on the same page, in this case, we're not looking to reduce an image. In this case, our diffusion model is taking a noisy flow field or a noisy depth map and giving us a cleaner depth map or a cleaner flow field. And now the image is the conditioning signal, right? So it's a little bit about, and I'm going to skip over some of the technical barriers we had to go through, but the net result was sort of horrifying for someone who had worked on optical flow for years and years, because without any of the inductive biases and the mathematical formulations and thinking about the right conservation principles, without any of that, these models outperformed anything we had. So this is a model that has been trained actually just purely on synthetic data, and this is what we call DDVM. I think it stands for something like diffusion for dense vision models, I guess. But basically, the error in the model, this is the case for optical flow, was blowing away the state-of-the-art, which was previously the Raft model. And indeed, and when we fine-tuned it even more, we got something that was, you know, the field had sort of been creeping forward by small increments in terms of performance on benchmark, and this just blew it away and remains the state-of-the-art in the problem. And just to give you, this just shows one result, which is, you know, this is the prior state-of-the-art. So I'm zooming in on this region of the flow field, and it does a pretty good job, but it's just the diffusion model is way better with boundaries of objects, and it really captures sort of with high fidelity the underlying flow field. And let me skip over this. One cool thing that the model does is, again, let me go back to the very beginning of the talk, it really captures complex multimodal probability distributions. And there's certain things in the world which might actually be ambiguous. If I look at the mirror, a mirror, I don't know, is the depth of the mirror the wall on which it hangs? Or is it the stuff I see in the mirror? Now that's extreme, but there are a lot of cases where, you know, you look through glass, you have reflection. Models may truly be uncertain as to what they're capturing. And what we found is, like, for example, in this case, does the shadow on the ground move with the car, or is it fixed? And the model is uncertain. And when we look at multiple samples, some of them really just isolate the flow on the car, and some of them include the samples. And so on some, the windows move with the car, and in others, the windows do not. They move with the reflected stuff. And so they appear to capture the structure in these spaces. And the same for the same for depth. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. So what I've told you about so far is really these models are doing incredibly well on downstream tasks, like with classification accuracy score. They're sort of really interesting in terms of, they raise interesting questions in terms of alignment with human perception, and they're pretty good at a variety of vision tasks. Okay, and that sort of brings me to the end, except I want to show you some stuff we've been doing recently, and I'll take like just 1 minute or 2 minutes and show you a couple things, because these are stuff which either is not published yet or has just been published in the last couple of months. And there's still tons of stuff to do that we're working on. One of the things we've been wanting to do for a while is get rid of the cascades, because they're complex to train multiple models that have to talk to each other in the right ways. Wouldn't it be nice to have one diffusion model that went straight from a text prompt to a high resolution image? And we now have that. There's a way of doing progressive training on these models that allow us to go right up to 1K by 1K or 2K by 2K resolution directly in training from scratch. And the model is you know, just was state-of-the-art at the time. It's no longer the state-of-the-art. This is now a few months delayed. Another thing we've been looking at is how you can take one of these models and improve the quality of the model. So if I give you a measure of image aesthetics, for example, or if I give you any reward function on an image, can you optimize these models on the reward function to do even better? And people have been using reinforcement learning for this. But a couple guys on the team here in Toronto had this idea that we can propagate gradients directly through the stages of denoising in a diffusion model, so why don't we just do direct gradient descent? And that's what they've been doing. And so they take images like this from a fairly generic, older diffusion model, and then show that as you increase the weight on this fine-tuned reward model, the scenes become much more complex, much more nuanced, and these are fine-tuned on different reward signals. One is called pick score, one is called human preference score. And the last thing that we've been doing most recently is looking at ways to push the envelope to new types of diffusion models that do more stuff. And so one of the things we've been looking at is how to train models that will start either with an image or a text prompt or multiple images and be able to generate plausible three-dimensional views of the scene or in time as well. In other words, how do we take like a single image and ask the question, what would it look like from different viewpoints over time? So we want models that have control over space-time and allow you to condition on images. So these are all out-of-distribution inputs from the web or elsewhere. So you give it a single image, and in this case, we're just producing, we just move the camera around, assuming the scene is static, but we get nice structure that, the reflections all seem to make sense. The lighting coming between the trees, etc., the shadows on the ground, it's doing a good job. We can take the same model and use it like you could give it 2 images, and they say from those 2 images, extrapolate what would happen over time. In this case, the camera was fixed. And we get outputs like this from those 2 images. Or what you could do is take 2 images and interpolate between them. And that's what you're seeing here. So here, give it 2 images, and they're fairly far apart in the video sequence. Like this car is moving a fair ways between the 2 images we give it as input. And then this is sort of what you get in terms of the interpolated frames. And it also works on video-to-video problems, so that you could give it this video, which is the input, and ask for a stabilized view, maybe with the camera a little further out, so the plant is not taking up the full scene. And this is what we get as output. Or you can move the camera. Anyway, let me before I end, I just want to say that like I said at the very beginning, that the work done here, lest you think I had much to do with it, it is the result of a whole bunch of really bright, hardworking people, predominantly in the Google DeepMind team. And I won't name them all, but they're all superstars. So I'll stop there.